Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here, and this is actually the third time I've recorded this because, I've tried to record a couple of answers to this specific question and just put them at the end of other videos, and it just hasn't worked because it's one of those questions which has enough depth to it that I'm going to take like 3 to 4 minutes to answer it, and that just doesn't work if you're trying to put it onto the end of like a really well produced and scripted video, because this isn't scripted, as you might be able to tell. If you think breaking these out into their own videos is a good idea, feel free to let me know in the comments. And whilst you're there, feel free to throw in a question for next time. I'm always interested to see what questions people have of me, and it's pretty fun to answer them actually. It's why I wanted to spend so long doing this particular question. Anyway, this question is actually from a friend of mine from Providence called Thunder, and he asks me, do you think that a rebalance of battleship hulls is needed, or a T2 PvP non-clunky battleship would benefit the meta? Alright, well let's start on the first part of that, which is, do I think the battleship hulls need a rebalance? And I guess that really just depends on what you mean by rebalance, because I've heard it kind of used in several different terms depending on the area in which it's being used. I personally take rebalance to mean something closer to a rework, where you're taking a lot of slots, you're trying to better mold a ship to fit roles that you don't think it fits. And, I don't think battleships as a whole really need that. I think battleships, most battleships have a place. I think that's the point that I'm trying to get at here. I have a very hard time right now sitting here thinking of a battleship that doesn't have a very defined role and, doesn't see at least some use, although probably not to the same level it would have, 4 or 5 years ago. Even older ships that weren't that useful, if I was making this in 2012, 2013, I would have been like, the Raven's really good for PvE, but what use does it have in PvP? And thanks to the jump Raven doctrine, we've kind of seen an answer to that. You can actually make the Raven work in PvP, you just have to use its range. Anyway, if instead of talking about like a bigger rebalance or rework, we were going to look at like a balance pass, just taking a look at each individual ship and giving it a little nudge here and there in whatever direction we wanted, I think that would probably be a good idea. There's definitely a couple of battleships that could use more power grid or more CPU, but I don't think that's a hugely pressing concern for them. I think more pressing concerns for them are like in the almost quality of life area. I think all battleships could really use a much more expanded cargo hold, just so that they can be able to pack up the resources that they need to be effective for a very long fight. And long fights are what you really want to be getting with something like a solo PvP Dominix or a solo PvP Megathron or Hyperion or whatever. You want that fight to last like 6-7 minutes, so that you can really get the advantage out of having your reps, having your newts, and all that kind of thing, just catching someone out of position eventually. There's a lot of reasons why you'd want the fight to go long as a battleship, and then you have the cargo hold really constraining the amount of time you can be in a fight. And I'd love to see that shifted further in the direction of battleships being slightly more self-sufficient there, although I don't like them being ultimately the most self-sufficient thing in the world. And then on top of that, I think you have the warp speed problems. Like, the warp speed changes were implemented in a time where battleships were very, very dominant, and as their dominance faded away, I think we've seen that the 2 AU a second thing is just really unfun. Like, it's so much slower than everything else that you want to just put like a hyperspatial on something just to make it go fast enough that you can feel like you're not going to spend like 2 hours roaming around without probably getting a fight. And I think bumping it up to like 2.5 AU a second and leaving that as 2.5 AU a second gradients between cruisers, battle cruisers and battleships would do a lot to make it a lot nicer to roam in a battleship, if that makes sense. Anyway, something that I really do like about battleships though, and that other people might see as a weakness, is the fact that battleships really rely on having cruisers and destroyers and other ship classes mixed in with them to work properly. The fact that you're going to need some command destroyers to maybe add to your mobility and also to provide defender launches so you can't get bombed. You're going to need, either T2 logistics in your cruisers if you want to retain that mobility, or you use capitals and a fax if you need that repping power. You have Hugens to help your application. You can use EAFs and other recons. There's a lot of you're not really constrained as much by class as you might be in another doctrine. And I really like that. I think that's one of the more interesting parts of how battleships work. And I think it's generally pretty healthy, because it means that if you're trying to fight down on cruisers, you have a place to actually, use your power there. If you're bringing a doctrine that can kill cruisers really well but doesn't have the right DPS, you can still make an impact by killing off their logistics and then going for the battleships after that. Anyway, I generally think that the problem with battleships more comes down to the meta that they're a part of than the actual power level of the ships themselves. I think that the threats that are able to hit down onto battleships, so stuff like BFGs, stuff like fighter bombers, those are what really keep battleships from being used in a larger strategic sense. And then you have the warp speed penalties and some other stuff like that really kicking in on the lower end. And because of that, battleships don't have a place. You do see them be used in low sec a lot, where those threats aren't as big of a concern, and I think that's due to the fact that they do have that power level. Outside of the super capital stuff, I guess you have bombers, but you have a lot of counterplay that you didn't used to have against bombers, especially with defender launchers, with bushing, with all of that sort of thing. So I don't feel like they are the problem that's really keeping them down right now, but maybe other people can tell me differently in the comments. And then I guess on the other hand, you just have the competing doctrines, which are things like Munions, which do really, really well at killing Hugans, which is probably one of the reasons why you don't see battleships used defensively against them. But, in general, I don't have a huge problem with hacks beating battleships. That's kind of how it's supposed to work, historically. The real problem there, I think, is just the range creep that's come in. The fact that most cruisers can shoot as far, or to some extent further, than a battleship can with an effective fit is, that irks me a little bit, I won't lie. But I feel like that's something that can be addressed in the future, and if that does get addressed, you'll probably see battleships be in a much better place without them having to change at all. And I don't think that boosting the battleship's range to keep up with the hacks would be a very healthy thing either. I know someone's going to suggest that in the comments, so I figure I'd give my thoughts on that right now. Hopefully that wraps up the first part of the question for you sufficiently. And now it's time to get on to the second half of the question, which is talking about whether or not I think T2 battleships would be beneficial to the meta. That's obviously a very loaded and deep question, because it depends entirely on what you want your T2 combat battleship to do. But if we're just talking about like a baseline, like I guess a battleship version of a hack, so a heavy assault battleship, that's something that I think would generally not be good for EVE. Like, it's hard trying to formulate this thought, but generally in my experience, when the strategic subcap doctrines get more expensive, it makes people less likely to actually engage with them on a day-to-day basis. And the less you have people be willing to engage each other, the less fights you're going to get, the less engagement you're going to get with the game, and generally it just makes the meta worse and worse, just from a playing perspective rather than from a health of the meta perspective. That said, it's not as if I can't imagine like a T2 battleship really working and having a good place in the metagame. I just think that you really need to lean in more heavily on what T2 is supposed to be, which is very specialized towards one aspect of the game and doing it really, really well. And I also think that there is, kind of room within that idea to bring in battleships and give battleships a more unique role and a unique feel on the battlefield. Something that immediately springs to mind for me, at least, is looking into what you could do with the technology that CCP was working on with the Abyssals, other than procedural generation. And for those of you who haven't been in Abyssals, what I mean by that is the AoE E-War tech that is kind of built into that structure. There's drone destroying stuff, there's tracking disrupting stuff, there's also tracking bonus stuff, which is interesting. And what I'd like to see is that kind of transitioned into a battleship hull. I think it would be really interesting, for example, if you brought out like a T2 Rogue and gave it the ability to do an AoE ECM or something like that. Not an ECM burst, but actually just apply ECM every 10-20 seconds in a big sphere. And you could do the exact same thing with a T2 Abaddon, have that do it, but with tracking disrupting. And I think that there could be a lot of interesting gameplay with that. It would put a lot more pressure on FCs to position, which as an FC is something I really love. I think positioning is the most interesting part of the game. But yeah, I think as long as you let them not be able to be repped whilst they were AoE bursting, I think that'd be really fun. I think it could open up a lot of pilot skill, and just generally add another bit of texture to the game, which is always what you want. Alright, and before I wrap this up, there's a couple of fairly common suggestions of what a T2 battleship might look like. So I'm just going to run through my opinions on those really quickly here at the end. The first one is a T2 battleship with an anti-cap gun, and I really don't like that idea. I think if you make it a battleship, it's got to be very tanky, and you're either going to make it a glass cannon-y sort of thing, at which point it doesn't feel like a battleship, or you're going to make it very tanky, at which point it's going to impinge on the role of dreadnoughts, and you're also going to potentially run into the problem where you put Hors on it and it just becomes effectively a battleship level hack. By just doing way more DPS and having more tank than a T1 battleship does. I'd much rather see that role given to a T2 attack battlecruiser. It'd probably take reworking the models entirely, which is unfortunate, but I feel like it works better on a very dedicated glass cannon-y hull to begin with, so you can really build it up to be something that's a little more different than a dreadnought. And then on the other hand, you have the idea of a battleship level logistics. And as I talked about earlier, I really like the fact that battleships have to use different hulls in order to augment their power. And T2 cruisers, and more specifically T2 logistics, are a part of that. I really like that if you bring a high application doctrine and you can position yourself right, you can get on top of their logistics and you can kill them. And if you replace that with, battleship level logistics, you're just going to all end up in a death ball, and it's just not going to be as interesting, in my opinion. I think it would remove a lot of the nuance from fleet PvP, but that's just my opinion. Feel free to tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. Alright, well that about sums up my thoughts on this subject. Thank you to Fartender for sending in the question. We've gone a lot longer than I expected to talking about this. I think it's going to be a 13-14 minute video. Hopefully I'll be able to cut out some pauses there and make things a little shorter. But stay tuned, on Friday, Saturday-ish, I'll hopefully have a news video. There's been a lot going on in New Eden, as always. And I'll try and get a fleet video out for you as well, but that's a lot more dependent on me getting good fights than anything else. Anyway, until next time, fly smart. Alright, well that about sums up my thoughts on this subject. Thank you to Fartender for sending in the question. We've gone a lot longer than I expected to talking about this. I think it's going to be a 13-14 minute video. Hopefully I'll be able to cut out some pauses there and make things a little shorter. But stay tuned, on Friday, Saturday-ish, I'll hopefully have a news video. There's been a lot going on in New Eden, as always. And I'll try and get a fleet video out for you as well, but that's a lot more dependent on me getting good fights than anything else. Anyway, until next time, fly smart.